Hello, hope all is well. In this video, I'm going to analyze Game 7 of the World Championship match between Sergei Karjakin and Magnus Carlsen. This is the second of two white games in a row that Karjakin was going to have against Carlsen in the match because Carlsen started with one white and presumably can finish with one white in round 12. And so this was a big opportunity to sort of put pressure in one of the white games on Carlsen. Now, to date, Karjakin had just been trotting out e4, and I found that particularly suspicious because in his seconds, his assistants that helped him with the opening preparation were primarily non-e4 players, or rather d4 players. So Vladimir Potkin and a Russian player, and Shakir Mamedyarov from Azerbaijan, both notable d4 players. So finally, we saw d4. Carlsen played d5, and he's actually sort of switched his d4, the openings he's played against d4 around a lot, and I've tended to find more weaknesses in his opening preparation against d4. So I was really curious to see what he'd bring out here this time. Karjakin went for c4, c6, and here we had a Slav. And I was actually surprised by this choice because typically Carlsen will tend to go for Queen's Gambit accepted in drawing situations, or even Bogos or Nimzos, those types of things. Slav is not so much. But after knight c3, knight f6, and e3, we saw sort of a weird looking Slav position where essentially normally black goes knight f3, which is a little bit more active and preserves the development of the bishop to f4, g5. And here, Carlsen would have had to choose from a few concrete lines. Like if he goes e6, you allow some of the sharp Moscow and anti-Moscow lines up to bishop g5. If you go, I mean, you could actually go in that position Cambridge Springs, which he's done before with this knight bd7 and queen a5, but tough to say. And if you go after knight f3, if you go dc4, you actually allow these sharp Dutch Slav lines, which I don't think is very suitable to Carlsen's style. So e3, I was actually wondering what he'd go for, and he actually decided to go for a6. And basically the idea is that typically after e3, you're covering defending the pawn on c4, so it's not advisable to take here right away because after bishop takes c4, white has already prominent influence on the diagonal, on the a2 g8 diagonal, and typically white often loses a half tempo by having to go bishop e2 and then taking on c4, and here white did it in one go, which is not good for black. So here bishop f5 is another option, but it's actually a pawn sacrifice because after c takes d5, c takes d5, queen b3, the queen on b3 is the pawn on b7 is remarkably difficult to defend, and well, typically play will go like knight c6, queen takes b7, bishop d7, and I don't think Carlsen was wanting to go for something sharp like this, where you give up a pawn and play gets very concrete. Not really his style. So after e3, instead of bishop f5, he went for a6, and we have an a6 Slav. And this is only acceptable because the bishop on c1 hasn't actually gotten outside the pawn chain. If the bishop was, say, on f4 already, then a6 would sort of be unacceptable because there'd just be too many dark square weaknesses on the queen side. So after a6, bishop d3, normal developing move, d takes c4 here. And here we see the difference between d takes c4 here and before when I was showing it. Here, with this bishop d3 move, white sort of wasted a half tempo. And so now after bishop takes c4, Carlsen can go back to e6 and transpose to essentially Queen's Gambit accepted setup with this pawn on e3. So very interesting way to play. After knight f3, Carlsen went c5, that's standard. And then castles was played, and then b5. And this is actually a very, very good version of the Queen's Gambit accepted for white or for black, because The problem is this bishop just gets harassed, and it doesn't really have such a great square. If bishop b3, the bishop is sort of biting on granite on this diagonal, and it's not really having such a great influence. And if it goes to d3, it's actually sort of blocking the protection of the d4 pawn sometimes, and it's just at the wrong diagonal for the bishop to be on. So bishop e2 is really the only option. But you could see here, the bishop went from d3, then it took on c4, and now back to e2. So like the Tour de France of the bishop was not particularly inspiring. And this all gave black valuable time. So now bishop e7 is played, and now this light-squared bishop, if you compare it to the one on e2, has a much more prominent diagonal. So, yeah. Now, d takes c5 was played. You could make an argument for making another waiting move, but it's tough to say what. Like if you went b3, and then maybe the point is that if the bishop moves again, you take on c5, and you sort of again have that half-tempo advantage of making the bishop move twice to get to c5. But I don't think he would have played bishop e7. I think he would have played a move like knight bd7, and then thought about taking the pawn with the knight. So, because there's basically a bunch of waiting moves you can make as black, which are useful, like rook c8 and knight bd7, and sometimes even taking on d4. So after bishop e2, bishop e7, d takes c5, knight c6 was played, and this is actually the first really new move, and I think it's a good novelty. The point is that you don't rush to take this pawn on c5, which is pretty much going to be secured anyway, and you keep the tension in the middle with the queens, and you give yourself the option of taking back with the queen with the rook on d8, and giving yourself a potential control of the d file. Typically, if bishop takes c5, you have these positions where there's queen takes d8, check, king takes d8, and now the king is slightly exposed, and it gives white a little bit of time to develop the rest of the queen side. Now, typically the king will go to e7 and be tucked away, but white is known to have a slight advantage in these positions. So, knight c6 changes all of that, because now the queen trade is not as advisable. Now, in this position, Karjakin went knight d2, and that's just a bad move. The knight redeployment doesn't really help that much. But here the engines are actually saying b4, and it's actually a very interesting move. The point is that c5 pawn is protected, and so now you really have to take on b4, and now after knight takes b4, a4, and you essentially liquidate the queen side. I'm sure Carlsen had something against this. It might just be a draw, because if all these queenside pawns are exchanged and the black king has no problems, then it's just equal. But it was a very interesting computer line, at least. So, but knight d2 is really a slow move, because now after bishop takes c5, black has regained the pawn, and it's tough to say how the rest of white's queen side is going to be deployed. So, knight d4 was played, and that was actually Karjakin's idea. But after subsequent knight takes, and bishop e7, this knight on e4 is a little bit loose and unprotected. And so black already, I think, has a slight advantage, because all of black's minor pieces are better placed. The bishop on e2 doesn't really have much purpose right now. The bishop on c1 has no particular scope. And the rook on a1 is not yet connected to another heavy piece, whether it be the queen or the rook. So these are all deficiencies in the position that are problems to solve. So Karjakin played b3, but again, not sort of the best move. I mean, the bishop would love to be on this diagonal, but it's really a question of time, because now Carlsen played knight b4, and it immediately sort of attacks some of these weak squares on the queen side that are a consequence of sort of white's slow play. And now you can imagine knight c2 being a problem. You can also imagine a potential bishop f6 at some point hitting the a1 rook, and then the a2 pawn is hanging. And also this bishop on b7 is uncovered, so the e4 knight is hanging. So all these factors essentially create uncomfortable tension. And it's amazing now with black already, Carlsen just has a slight advantage by move 14. So Karjakin went bishop f3, protecting the knight, the only reasonable thing one can do. And here Carlsen probably missed an opportunity. He castled, which is typically there's nothing wrong with castling. But f5 here was really, really a good move. And the point is that it's just to get the bishop in all these lines to f6 where it harasses the a1 rook. So just to illustrate that, if knight d6 check, this actually secures the two bishops for right after queen takes d6. But the problem is after a move like bishop takes b7 and rook b8, eventually you have to contend with queen takes d1 and bishop f6. So if bishop f3, queen takes d1, rook takes d1, bishop f6, this rook now has to move from this diagonal. After rook b1, knight takes a2, black is a pawn up for the good and is already threatening a nasty fork on c3, and this would just be horrible suffering for white. So f5 would have been really strong. And another line which illustrates that is that if knight eg5, let's say you have queen takes d1, rook takes d1, bishop takes f3, knight takes f3, bishop f6. Again, the rook is guarding the a2 pawn, so it's really presumably you want to defend it. But after knight d4, which blocks the diagonal, now bishop takes d4 is a really nifty trick because rook takes is impossible because of the c2 fork. So e takes d4 be forced. And now after a move like knight d5, the structure is so ugly for white. Black's going to play rook c8 next and control the file. And it's just going to be a long-term suffering. And, well, Karjakin has proved that suffering, he could deal with long-term suffering, but not like this. I really, really think Carlsen missed an opportunity here. Now, the issue is, I mean, why don't you play a move like f5? Well, it's sort of a strange-looking move to make where you sort of move the f-pawn so early in the game, particularly before castling. And so these factors, I think, definitely were reasons why it may not have even been on Carlsen's radar at all. So, yeah. So castles is a safer move, but sort of loses any chance at a sort of a lasting pull. Bishop a3 was played, good move, exploiting this pin of the knight to the bishop on e7, and also sort of finally connecting the rooks and the queen, rather. And here, I think Carlsen is spoiled for choice. I still think black is slightly better because there are weaknesses on the c file that matter, particularly c3 and c2. And a move like bishop d5 is one that I was looking at that I thought is really strong, just solidifying the protection of the b7 bishop, which was hanging, sort of making sure that knight f6 check doesn't come, because here knight f6 check was a threat. Keeping some piece on the board, not trading queens right away. And yeah, nothing to really complain about. But Carlsen made a move that was just really, really mystifying. Just a mistake, just a bad move. Rook c8. And I would actually argue that any other move is actually better than that. Because now after this knight f6 move, this bishop on b7 is still hanging. And to add insult to injury, now the c8 rook would also be attacked after a subsequent capture on b7. And so Carlsen really, really missed the boat. I would argue, again, in this position, instead of rook c8, any legal move that does not hang a piece is actually better for black. Rook b8 is acceptable, bishop d5 is acceptable, queen b6 is acceptable. So it's really, really mystifying that rook c8 was played. But hey, these guys may be tired. They've been playing this long match. I don't know. I don't have many excuses. But knight f6 check, bishop takes f6, bishop takes b7, and now here's the problem. Yes, white's rook on a1 is hanging, but all of black's pieces are hanging. So really, it's just a bad deal here. So Carlsen, I think, realizing sort of the error in his ways, now tried to get a position that he felt he could hold, and he did a good job of finding one that he could hold. So this is sort of instructive to see the exchanges he makes. First, he plays bishop takes a1. Then after bishop takes b4, there's still a bunch of things hanging. The a1 bishop, the c8 rook, the f8 rook. Now bishop f6 back. And the point is that he wants to get an opposite colored bishop endgame. Because now, after bishop takes f8, queen takes d1, rook takes d1, and rook takes f8. Now black is going to be a pawn down after bishop takes a6. But because these opposite colored bishops on the board, it gives him really good drawing chances. And after this move, b4, the a2 pawn is fixed. So that now any push of the pawn like a4, there's en passant, and it's just no good. So now that this a2 pawn is an extra pawn, it's backward though, so it really doesn't feature as a particular strength. And so Karjakin went rook c1 to try and control the file. And now g6, very important move, giving black an escape square. And now rook c2 just has nothing better than to just protect the a2 pawn and cover the second rank because a move like rook a8 was threatened. And the only pitfall black has to look out for here is bishop c3. Bishop c3 would be an awful, awful blunder because in some lines a4 becomes a move, and after en passant, then the c3 bishop would be hanging. So that's the only thing that black really has to look out for. Other than that, if he just holds the fortress, it's very tough to see white making a pass pawn. And the trade of rooks would just make it an easy draw. So rook a8, good move. Bishop d3. And again, bishop c3 would not be ideal. So rook d8, bishop e2. And just holding this fortress is actually remarkably easy to do. So Carlsen essentially just improves the rest of his pieces and then makes a draw. So the final moves were king f8, just getting the king to the middle. King f1, rook a8, bishop c4, rook c8, effectively pinning the rook now. And that was sort of another important thing, is that the king actually couldn't effectively get, in this position, the king couldn't effectively get to the queen side without actually blocking one of the files for the rook. And so bishop c4 tried to do that. But after bishop c4, now the bishop is pinned to the rook, and because any subsequent trade of the rooks just means it's a dead draw. So king e2, king e7, f4, h6, just sort of making sure not to get squeezed on the king side, and just preparing g5. King f3, rook c7, g4, and g5. Finally, just holding up the black's end of the bargain on the king side, and really no effective way to get through. After king e4, rook c8 was played, and here they actually accepted a draw, because there's no particular way for white to break through here. Again, the a2 pawn is backward. Any trade of the bishops is just a dead draw. This would be welcomed by rook takes c2, and bishop takes c2. This would be no way to get in here. And yeah, the rook has no way to get in on the d file or any of the other files. So good hold by Carlsen after really a blunder, I would say, after the rook c8 move. But at the same time, it's a bit disappointing because he was so much better so quickly in the game, really by move 10 after this knight d2, and wasn't able to capitalize. And we've seen this theme throughout the match. Carlsen gets a slight advantage, doesn't capitalize. And you have to wonder, if Karjakin gets his chance, what will he do? So I've been saying every draw that they play, advantage goes further and further to Karjakin, because it means he's one game away from the biggest upset we could have imagined. But perhaps not even the biggest upset this year. I mean, we've had Trump, we've had Brexit, we've had LeBron coming down from a 3-1 final. So, yeah, it's been a lot of upsets this year. But, yeah. Now, on the other hand, Karjakin's preparation was really not great. And I think it really, more than anything else, just demonstrates the lack of ambition he's had at times. And you'd like to see more of that. I think partially his strategy is just to sit on Carlsen, let him play the game and be aggressive, and then take his openings when they come. But you would like to see a little bit more from Karjakin. But then again, he doesn't play d4 so much, and it showed, because knight d2 is just not a move you make. Anyways, Thanks for tuning in, and I'll have more coverage soon. Have a good one.